Hey, hello everyone. It's Warrington Ellicott from the Canadian Association of Importers and Exports on the Canadian A version of the SimplyTrade podcast, brought to you by the good folks at the Global Training Center. With me this morning is our good friend Yannick Trudell. He's a partner at our good friends McMillan in Montreal, and his practices regards to international trade. And he brings a wealth of experience and expertise to this discussion today, because we've had some consequential bills come through Parliament here that I wanted to get everyone's attention to. So welcome, Yannick. How are you today?
Welcome. Good morning, Warrington. It's a pleasure to be with you this morning. There's a lot of going on. I feel like there's been a lot of going on on the trade front for over a year and a half now, certainly. But no, there's been a lot in recent weeks on the forced labor front. So it's great to be here and to be discussing.
Yeah, and I know folks are getting very anxious around that July 1 date with our USMCA renewal, but we're not here to talk about that today. Just to update listeners in the United States on activities in Canada, Parliament has adjourned for the summer, so nothing is going to transpire in Ottawa until September 21st when Parliament resumes. But I thought it would be important for everyone to talk about three consequential bills that were released just last week in Parliament. And that's the purpose of our call today. So let's start with Bill C-35. Bill C-35 is a forced labor bill mirroring somewhat under the terms of the UFLPA in the United States. Yannick, why don't you give the listeners a little bit of a profile of the existing framework for forced labor in Canada today?
This bill is a bit of a pivot from the Canadian government. In 2024, January 24, the government of Canada, as we recall, they adopted the Fighting Against Forced Labor and Child Labor and Supply Chains Act, right? And that's really what kicked off the responsibility of companies in Canada to track their supply chains. And there was a lot of confusion. And what was very striking about this act is that it targeted pretty much everyone that
that's correct.
Goods or import goods, right? So, and it was a lot of confusion at first because Canadian businesses, as most businesses do, they don't have visibility on every tier of their supply chain. They have some relationship with their first tier suppliers, but that would be it. So that's what it really kicked things up. But the act itself, apart from a reporting obligation, there was no real enforcement that we could to speak of. It's more of a soft obligation to provide a report. We've had these reports for a few years, and then kind of move us to June 2nd, U.S. Section 301 investigations. I think that's what really triggered things here. The United States announced a 10% tariff on Canadian goods, amongst other.
Yeah, 60 nations were involved in the action for the listeners.
Exactly.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Very extensive ruling by the United States.
So since then, every Canadian goods are imposed a 10% tariff, except if they're USMCA compliant. So that, of course, going to exclude about 90% of Canadian produced goods that are exported. But yeah, and as a very quick answer, I think it's within 10 days, the government has tabled this bill C-35, which brings some more enforcement, which really, if adopted in a form that's similar, because as you mentioned, Parliament is adjourned and a lot can change from the bill to the actual law that's going to be adopted. But there's very interesting pieces to how this legislation changed the powers of the CBSA. All of this is going to be enforced, and especially who bears the burden of proof. One thing that's worth mentioning, and we'll discuss this more in detail, is that Canada, when they adopted the Fighting Against Forced Labor and Child Labor and Supply Chain Act, there was a parallel import bans that ban imports of goods produced by child labor and forced labor. But the very few shipments, I think we have about 50 shipments that were stopped and only 2 that really were seized at the border in the last couple of years. So that was an issue, and I think that was what triggered the criticism from the U.S. So this bill really tries to put more teeth on the measure and on the enforcement front.
Yeah, so to recap for everyone, as Yannick described, so we've got the S-211, which is the slavery reports. Those are due annually by May 31st of every year, and importers in Canada are having to file those reports today. And then, of course, we have the Customs Act and all the existing laws and provisions that were in place as Bill C-35 was tabled are today in place. So, of course, forced labor and child labor is effectively not permitted in Canada. And speaking on behalf of all of our members, I think our members take this question very seriously, and we want to eliminate these kinds of things in our supply chains. So let's take a closer look at C-35 here. So some of the key provisions was a change really in the general prohibition, right? Instead of, it's more a presumptive activity similar to what the United States has done. Is that correct?
Yes, no, absolutely. It's more prohibitive. I think that one of the big points here is really the change on the onus of proof, switching from the CBSA to the actual importer or owner. The one interesting part is that both importer of record and owners are said to be liable for imports and any penalty that may ensue. So that's interesting, and it's going to be this onus of proof is going to shift through mostly a supposed list that the government will issue and will be updating. So a list of either countries or regions or specific companies that will be presumed to be linked with forced labor. And may I mention here another interesting point? We're really talking about forced labor, and kind of lost the definition of child labor in there. So it might be included. Forced child labor, of course, is going to be included, but we don't have this direct mention of child labor. Which was
in the current text that was tabled
current text
in the House of Commons. Correct. Yeah. So I think listeners, of course, our foreign listeners should understand there likely will be consultations on the bill over the summer period. So some of the issues that we talk about today may come up in consultation and get resolved once the House of Commons returns and the bill proceeds to committee. But I think that the list is an important point because obviously I think the classifications of goods now in Canada and the United States really matter, right? Consistency of the classifications of the articles compared to these lists is going to be of vital importance to traders, correct?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And yes, consistency is going to be important. And amongst other things about your, making sure that you're reviewing how you declare goods, both sides of the border, right?
Right. And then, of course, the list, I think, is going to be also vitally important that obviously the United States has its entity list. And now this list is going to be managed by Foreign Affairs, not Public Safety. So there may be some changes there that traders are going to have to be aware of as well, correct?
Right. And it's always interesting, too, because we're never sure how government entities work one with another. I think there's a lot of people who assume that, well, it's the government of Canada and they coordinate, and there's going to be some kind of currency. While, on the ground, as you mentioned, if it's a different department, there might be different interpretation, different applications, and we might have a few disconnect. Speaking again to the fact that as the bill is tabled right now, they are using different definitions also. So Public Safety Canada relate to forced labor and child labor, and now we're going to work on to look only on forced labor. So is this going to be fixed, or was this on purpose? We don't know. How is it going to happen? Is it going to be a more narrow interpretation of foreign affairs? We'll see.
And I think this onus and proof is also going to put more administrative burden and diligence onto the importer, correct?
Yeah. And I think that's the kind of the natural flow of a ramping up in Canada for taking forced labor and supply chain seriously. Starting with these reports, I remember in 2024 I was giving conferences to compliance officer, custom brokers. We're discussing this with companies, and we're telling people in a very complex industry, automotive industry, the aircraft industry, who have thousands of suppliers, who themselves have a lot of suppliers, and they're falling off their table because the laws were saying, like, you need every layer. That's how it was. The Fighting Against Forced Labor Act was tabled. You need visibility, and you need to declare every layer of the supply chain. Most people in Canada or elsewhere don't have much visibility past the first layer of your first tier supply. So here, is going to really change the burden, and it's going to be quite a burden to be able to in terms of documentation, to be able to prove that you're like it is in the United States, to prove that there was no forced labor. Is going to change your the way you will deal with your foreign suppliers. And sometimes it's very difficult, especially if you're not a huge company and you're dealing with these massive manufacturers and China and Asian countries, and you might not be a big player, and you'll need to ask them documentation and proof. It's going to be very hard to, in some cases, to have it, to get it.
Yeah, and I think the other thing the bill does is its intention is that this list will has not been defined clearly just yet, but I think the concepts of either geographic location or entities that have been called out by other jurisdictions or a commodity-based approach, I think are all on the table as the bill proceeds through Parliament, right?
Yeah, and I think we can all make our guess on which countries will be figuring out on these lists first. In terms of industries were, with textile, critical minerals, electronic, solar panels have been in the news for years now. So there's certainly certain industries that are going to be targeted, and that we can be sure that they're at top of mind of the legislator at this moment.
Yeah, and I think it's fair to say for our U.S. listeners and Mexican listeners that just because Canada has tabled this piece of legislation doesn't necessarily mean that the 10% tariffs that were originally proposed by the United States are somehow going to go away, and this is going to satisfy the requirements of the U.S. administration. So I think time will tell. But I think from a next steps perspective, listeners on the pod today, I think one of the most prudent things to do is to review the document and the bill in detail. And we'll provide you the link, but you can go to the Parliament of Canada, look for legislative info, and you'll find C-35 there, and the full text of the bill is there. And I just want to quickly turn to a couple other pieces of legislation that are quite different and not really directly trade-related files, but they do have an implication here in terms of trading, because as we've witnessed, the amount of data that we all must provide as we trade internationally and here within North America is increasing exponentially. And the government has come out with two proposals. One is Bill C-34, and that's a Digital Safety Act. Now, this is effectively a social media protection bill for children. So it's an online protection bill for 18 and under. And it mirrors what has transpired somewhat in the Australian example. And now last week, the UK tabled legislation. Now, obviously, this is not a direct implication for traders, but if traders are operating websites where there are chat facilities between consumers in that website, there could be an implication there. So I would encourage everyone on the pod today to take a look at that if you're operating online in Canada. And then secondly of all, I think, which we're going to talk about here in a little bit more detail, is C-36. Now that's basically a Consumer Data and Privacy and Protection Act. Now this impacts traders because it's what the bill tries to do is obviously protect data for both personal information and its use in commercial purposes. So Yannick, I'd like to get your perspective on how you feel C-36 will implicate commercial border and commercial traders in Canada.
Yeah, so there's a few interesting things. And it might not be obvious when you first read, I think, Bill C-36 that it has an impact on trade, because trade is not really at the forefront of this. But I think just generally, the way I understand this bit is that it may comes into frictions at some points with what's in the USMCA. For instance, we know we've talked a lot in recent years, trade and data flow. There's obviously a chapter in the USMCA which is being revised at the moment. And these, when you look at Bill C-36, there's a few provisions that may restrict the data localization, the cross-border data flow, free data flow, and such. So I think this is one of the impact that may have an impact that may be raised. We know the U.S. is very sensitive when it comes to protecting their company who are in the business of gathering data and selling data. We've seen that the US have been very aggressive, and the EU and also in Canada, in protecting their data intensive industries. So is it going to be another piece of legislation that's going to create friction that will then translate and maybe spill over and get more more aggressive tariffs from the US as a negotiating tool? It's going to be interesting to.
Yeah, because I think it's not clear the government's position on what data sovereignty is for Canada. I think that's a discussion still to be tabled in the House. So I think that is time will tell. But I think it's fair to say that, C-36 and C-35 should be on everyone's radar over the summer, and take a look at the bills and see how that implicates you as we move forward into the fall. So I guess, Yannick, to kind of close here, what are the kinds of things traders in the United States trading with their Canadian partners should be thinking about when reviewing C-35? What's your best recommendation?
Well, I think it will depend if you're a manufacturer or a distributor. If you're a distributor in the United States and you're selling to Canadian companies, you will likely be asked more questions on where you're sourcing the goods. So it's always good, I think. And I think the United States, most companies I've worked with have these, they're asking some kind of certificates to their suppliers as a very minimum steps. When you're buying abroad, you're asking your suppliers to provide certificates or some kind of insurance that they have steps to ensure there's no forced labor and their supply chains. So this is one thing. I know a lot of people also this week have raised questions regarding the prison labor. It was all over the news. There's been a complaint filed with the CBSA and at the Canada Competition Bureau regarding goods that were imported using Alabama prison labor. So human rights groups were complaining about this, that the CBSA should stop, amongst other things, these imports. Now, in terms of, I just want to clarify that forced labor and prison labor are two different things from a legal perspective. And so from a strictly legal point of view, we don't think that this bill would be applicable to prison labor at the moment, but it raised a lot of questions because everything was in the news over the past 2 weeks. So there's that. But really, for exporters into Canada, you're going to need to ramp up your documentation because it's going to be top of mind of Canadian importers.
100%. And I think the timeliness of the availability of that information also is going to be of pressing need. If ever there's an investigation at Canada's border, CBSA will be looking for a very quick response time from the trader involved to illustrate and defend the positions that the goods are not of forced labor. And so I think, be forewarned to be ready, I think is prudent advice, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And one other thing we haven't mentioned is good. It's going to be, once your goods are caught and the COGS and the CBSA starts seizing them and enforcing them, you're going to fall a bit at the mercy of the CBSA officer. The bill, as it's stable right now, also has a major impact on the recourse of importers to appeal a CBSA officer. So in Canada, usually you have, first thing, you can appeal a CBSA officer to the president of the CBSA. So it's forcing the CBSA to review internally the decision they're taking and give you some opportunity to make your arguments. And if that fails, usually you would go to the Canadian International Trade Tribunal, which is the equivalent to the US ITC. And now under this bill, it clearly states that we are carving out any recourse of appeal that are provided by the Customs Act. So no president of the CBSA review, no appeal to the CITT, and you're going to the judicial review to the Canadian Federal Court, which, as Canadian lawyers know, is very difficult to win because of the norms that have been applied. And in many cases, when it comes to customs, the federal court has not been very keen on applying this power of judicial review and has been deferring a lot to the CBSA, for instance, for customs matter. So it's going to be difficult to appeal if the CBSA officer sees your goods.
Yeah, so I think in closing, the message here, folks, is that things are changing in Canada. It's in motion right now. Likely consultation this summer, and certainly lots of discussion and debate in the fall. So I think, reviewing the bill, I think, is a good idea. get your thoughts together. And of course, if you're participating in the chambers of commerce or, obviously our members will be engaged, but start to have those conversations and start to get your concerns and questions at the ready. And we'll all see you in the fall. With that, Yannick, I'd like to thank you very much for coming on the pod today. Very informative as always. And those that are interested in contacting Yannick, will be providing his details along with everyone. So with that, guys, I'll bid you adieu. And as always, thanks to our friends at the SimplyTrade Pod, brought to you by the Global Training Center. Cheers.